Singapore's first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, left behind a legacy that continues to reign strong today.
This is your victory, a victory of the people.
He was intimidating with his piercing eyes and with his sharp question.
And I'm prepared to start all over again.
He was always concerned with the common man, giving the common man a better life.
But you know the Singapore government is going to do this because it is right.
He wanted young Singaporeans to know the Singapore story so they have a deep appreciation of where they came from.
Remember this photo? I also have the same photo.
Memories of the man from those who met him. In his lifetime, retired police officer Nordin Abdul Rahman has worn many hats. But his most memorable appointment would always be serving as a bodyguard to Singapore's first Prime Minister, the late Lee Kuan Yew.
When I joined the security branch, we had just been separated from Malaysia. It was due to mainly economic and political differences and racial tension. And also, we knew that with that kind of hostility from Malaysia, so our job as a security officer protecting him is more difficult.
The security team weren't the only ones reeling from Singapore's abrupt separation from Malaysia in 1965. Nordin recalls the turbulence of the times and how they took a toll on Lee.
All my life, you see, the whole of my adult life.
He was very disappointed of having to leave Malaysia, and then he seemed to be more determined and impatient to make sure that Singapore is a successful story. So all officers, all civil servants were very careful in discharging their duties because they did not want to make mistake. Because he was intimidating, and with his piercing eyes and with his sharp question, sometimes we could not answer exactly what he wanted to know.
Nordin's duties included accompanying Lee in the car during his travels across the city-state.
The Prime Minister do not talk much in the car, but he will always look around outside the car to see what's going on. But occasionally he will ask questions. One example was when I was with him traveling to his office. He saw a lorry, an open lorry, carrying earth. And as the lorry was overtaking our convoy, earth spilled onto the road. So he wasn't happy about that. And he asked where the lorry came from. Of course, I did not know where. So I said, perhaps it was from the nearby construction site. Then he asked me to book the lorry for dirtying the road. So that shows how he was concerned about the cleanliness of our road.
Nordin remembers well the areas he and Lee visited. Most were to new housing and infrastructure projects that were still in development.
The Prime Minister would usually go for night walk with Mrs. Lee. And they usually go to Istana. But at times, he also wanted to walk outside of Istana. The first time he walked outside was to go to Old Airport Road HDB Estate in Kallang.
When we arrived here, we stopped over there. So we were walking around the HDB blocks over there. So after 20-30 minute walk, he asked whether he could see the SIT flag. the older SI flat. So I decided to take him across the road and came over here. Well, for me, everything changed. It looks strange because all the buildings are new. I can't remember all the places that I visited before, but definitely it's the location where we stopped.
Nordin's fellow bodyguard, Karupaya Kandasamy, also has fond memories following Lee around. Kanda is 83.
I did realize that he was such a disciplined man. And after his duty every day without fail, whether rain, shine or thunder, he still wants to do his normal exercise. He was such a disciplined man. I salute him. On top of his exercise, Mr. Lee is very particular with his food. And the food is just simple, basic food. A handful of rice, plain white rice. One day, maybe a tiny piece of meat. Another day, a tiny piece of fish. One bowl of soup and plain vegetable. And during his meal, he will have no less than 4 different types of fruits.
Hey, Kanda.
Hey, how are you? Nice meeting.
Yeah, long time no
Wonderful.
see. Yep.
Looking great.
Lee Kuan Yew did have cheat days. Today, Kanda and Nordin savor one of Lee's favorite treats.
He used to take murtabak. Sometimes 1 month once, or sometimes 2 months once. I used to go and buy for him.
Okay.
And before I go and buy, I have to take 2 eggs from his house. I'll tell Sauche I'm going to buy murtabak, and she will give the 2 kampong chicken egg. I heard the taste is entirely different.
Now, remember this photo? This photograph.
I also have the same photo. Beautiful. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Oh, I have got one lovely photo. This was taken in Philippines. Some incident took place.
Okay.
I cannot forget.
Okay, what happened?
So I was detailed to stand and guard the entrance of the place. I saw someone driving a car driven by a lady. I said, "Excuse me, where are you going?" "Oh, I'm going to the conference room." I said, "Nobody can go anymore. All the head of countries, they are all inside. Nobody is supposed to go in."
Okay.
She said, "No, I have to go in." I became very suspicious. So I said, "Excuse me, can you please stand to the side, close the door?" When I closed the door, she wanted to run. I clipped her leg. When I clipped, she fell down. Took out my gun. I said, "You don't move. I want to make sure what is inside." Believe it or not, it was explosive. When I saw that, I quickly signaled the Philippine police officer who was standing by. Mr. Lee came to know later. He came out. He said, "You did a great job," he said.
I also had one experience at Marco Polo Hotel where Mr. Lee Kuan Yew attended the dinner. So when the dinner started, 20 minutes after it started, there was light blackout. The whole hotel was completely dark. So all the SOs rushed to the main table, surrounded him. I also went forward. I stood behind him. I touched his shoulder and I told him, "Sir, I'm behind you. Nordin behind you." And then I touched and then he said, "Thank you." All right. So when the light came back, so the guests were very surprised to see the whole table surrounded by security officers. And they gave us applause. So that's the
Very proud moment.
and it was a scare, no doubt. But nothing happened.
From the bottom of my heart, I'm telling the truth. I would have stood in between Mr. Lee and the bullet, and I would have taken that bullet to plunge into me rather than Mr. Lee. Why? If I had gone, Singapore would have not lost anything. But if he had gone, many of us will not be having the type of happy life what we are having today.
Like Kanda, retired architect Koh Siao Chuan is grateful for Lee's contributions to Singapore.
I have paintings of Lee Kuan Yew in my art collection, and they are very important to me. The first one, it was a portrait of Lee Kuan Yew practically at his prime. When he's smiling, is a painting that is bright and cheerful.
In the course of his career, Koh has met his hero Lee Kuan Yew several times. Those meetings were mostly about infrastructure projects like the Esplanade, which Koh helped design. But he will never forget his first encounter with the statesman in the 1970s, a story Koh continues to share with young architects today.
Singapore Planning and Urban Research Group was actually formed in 1965 when we were all part of Million Architects Co-Partnership.
In 1971, the Singapore Planning Urban Research Group, or SPUR, which Koh was a part of, were invited to meet Lee to share their views on shifting the location of Singapore's airport. It was situated at Paya Lebar at the time.
He invited us because he wanted to hear from us what motivated us to make all these responses to the government departments and to the press. And we told him that we are Singaporeans, very passionate about the future of Singapore. And we thought, as Singaporeans concerned about our country, we should have our voice heard. And we even proposed that it should be moved to Changi, to an area where we can have growth according to the growth of Singapore and what Singapore needs in the future. I think he himself saw the logic of that. He then responded by saying, yes, he accepts different points of view, and he agrees that Singapore is too small. And we need to have all the talent and all the best ideas. It gives us the impression that he's a man of the people, you know. And if we have something that can contribute to the future of Singapore, he's there to listen.
In the years that followed, Singaporeans began to experience their country's transformation and growth. They also witnessed Lee Kuan Yew's steely resolve to defend Singapore's interests.
And let there be no mistakes about it. Whoever governs Singapore must have that iron in him.
Cheong Yip Seng is a retired journalist with a career spanning over 43 years. He was formerly the editor-in-chief of the Straits Times. In the course of his work, he had frequent interactions with Lee Kuan Yew.
He's a serial fact checker. He doesn't take things at face value. He will always make it a point to check and cross-check. And that's one of the reasons why, when he was in office, he would regularly talk to us from the media, because he wanted our perspective on what is happening in Singapore.
The 1980s marked the dawn of a new era for Singapore. The country transformed from a third-world Asian nation into a bustling global hub. In December 1980, at an election rally, Lee Kuan Yew spoke of hard choices that got the country where it was.
And let there be no mistakes about it. Whoever governs Singapore must have that iron in him, or give it up. This is not a game of cards. This is your life and mine. I've spent a whole lifetime building this. And as long as I'm in charge, nobody's going to knock it down.
The way he spoke, the passion showed very clearly that this is a man not to be trifled with. You need iron in your soul to be able to run this place, because it's not easy to run Singapore.
To stay connected with sentiments on the ground, Lee closely monitored the letters page of the Straits Times, a section where readers shared their opinions and concerns on diverse issues.
On one occasion, we published a letter from a member of the public saying that the cost of healthcare in Singapore was too high, and he wanted more subsidies to be given by the government. It lit a fuse under him. He blew up. Because with that letter, we published a picture of the hospital. He thought we were trying to push for a welfare state in Singapore. Why do you need to publish a photograph to go with the letter? Are you trying to promote welfarism in Singapore? And you know that throughout his political life, he'd always been very conscious about the tendency of countries to drift towards welfarism. It very clearly showed to me that in the absence of the opposition, one of the things that he needed to do is to keep in touch with public opinion through the letter speech.
Cheong recounts that his relationship with Lee was complex, given their differing views on the role of the media in Singapore.
So he wanted the last word. He wanted control so that his agenda would not be blocked the way he saw it. But he is a very sophisticated media manager. He always made sure that he spent time looking at the media closely, watching them, watching us, making sure that we deliver information the way that would be most helpful to Singapore. He knew how much space to give to the media. He knew how much restraint he needed to exercise. It's a very delicate balancing act, and he played that role perfectly. He knew how to give us enough freedom while not giving up his goals.
Cheong and members of his newsroom would also go on to fulfill a personal goal of the senior statesman, one he hoped all Singaporeans would gain wisdom from. Cheong was asked to proofread Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs.
He wanted young Singaporeans to know the Singapore story so they have a deep appreciation of where they came from and what needs to be done going forward. They were one of the most memorable 5 years of my life because it gave me a first-hand insight into how he worked. He said, "Many thanks for the indefatigable effort to get the text right with my friendship, Lee Kuan Yew."
Other such relationships would blossom between Lee and those working alongside him.
Yes. Remember yellow rain trees? Correct.
For botanist Dr. Kiat Tan, Lee Kuan Yew's legacy is rooted in Singapore's greening journey. The 80-year-old spent 30 years helping Lee realize his vision of a garden city. Dr. Tan remembers fondly his drives with Lee and his wife around the Botanic Gardens in the 1980s when he was its director.
They made you feel part of a group, a part of their family. So it was very pleasant. It's like taking members of your relatives around for a spin in a place that you have been in charge of. It was quite interesting as to what they were interested in and quite different. Mr. Lee had a more holistic concept of what he envisioned the gardens to be. Mrs. Lee was interested in the flowering plants. So being the person in charge of the Singapore Botanic Gardens, I had to be up to date with the history of that garden and for the various points of interest in the gardens. I also needed to tell them what was in flower that they should take a look at.
Apart from staying updated about the gardens, one thorny issue that Dr. Tan had to tend to was nurturing local talent in Singapore's greening scene.
I always thought I would be working in the botany department of the University of Singapore. To my shock, that was one of the departments that was cut, because the thought then was we don't need to have botanists because they don't add to the economy of the country. So then I was fortunate enough to, during one of my tours with Mr. and Mrs. Lee, bring out the thought that if we don't have botanists, at the very least, we should have the handmaidens to botanists, meaning the horticulturists. They represent the very practical aspect of botany. So why can't I create a school of horticulture in the Singapore Botanic Gardens to train horticulturists to look after the green estate of Singapore? And they could immediately see that there was this need to train up people that really love the earth and love to work with their hands.
That training would be put to good use, not just at the Botanic Gardens, but in other parks and streetscapes across the island. In the late 2000s, Dr. Tan was invited to develop a garden on newly reclaimed land near the mouth of the Singapore River. The project blossomed into Gardens by the Bay.
The completion of the domes occasioned another visit by Mr. Lee.
We will be changing these exhibits 4 times a year, depending upon the season that we want to emphasize.
That's a lot of work.
I remember that in taking him around, he was reacting to it as would a future visitor to the gardens domes. He could see that this was going to be one of Singapore's landmarks to replace the Merlion.
In realizing the Gardens by the Bay project, Dr. Tan delayed his retirement. His determination to not let age get in the way of contributing to Singapore is something he learned from Lee Kuan Yew. Even after stepping down as Prime Minister at the age of 67, the veteran statesman was not done serving Singapore. Siblings Christine Lee and Lee Kian Seong have been running this shoemaking business for over 30 years. They stepped into their late father's shoes in 1991, inheriting his business and his loyal customers. Among them, the famous Lee Kuan Yew.
这个是李先生的鞋模，他的脚型就是后脚跟比较弯一点。 整个鞋子就是要跟他做鞋模，做了鞋模之后，我们就要做一个鞋子出来。鞋子就是它要前面要柔软的，后脚跟不可以一直拖出来的，它的要求是蛮高的。我们做鞋子这边要够硬，中间也是要硬，可以支撑它的重量。它走起路来就是这样走上，所以很舒服。
Lee Kuan Yew stepped down as Prime Minister in 1990. He remained in the government as senior minister. While he was no longer directly in charge of running the country, he continued to pay close attention to the livelihoods of Singaporeans. As for the siblings, Lee urged them to find a successor to the business to keep their trade alive.
他希望有继承人。 不过是太难找了继承人，
找不到接班的是可惜，很少人要学，所以是可惜了。 想到这个照片，但是他来的时候没有时间去换衣服，就跟他拍。不过我的朋友说很难看，应该换一个漂亮的衣服跟他拍照。
这个是我们从瓦斯里挖出来的李先生的脚型，就是李光耀的93年。这本读书图片集是李先生送给我们的，它里面写着我们是他们专业的做鞋子的。当然很感激他送给我们这本画册。想念他，就是蛮想念他的，因为已经是100岁了，如果还在的话，他是我们最好的顾客。
Okay, eat.
George Gascon has been a farmer for over 20 years. Before that, he had a very different job. He was a press photographer, something that gave Gascon very close access to what he calls the real Lee Kuan Yew. In the 1990s, he was given a very special assignment to photograph the statesman at home for Lee's biography, The Man and His Ideas.
He sat down in his chair and said, "Okay, shoot." And I was just standing there and studying the contours of his face. And then the editor told me, George, shoot. Relax. That's my style of taking pictures. I let my subjects settle down for a while before I start taking pictures. I dance around the table, taking pictures until the end of the interview, and probably, if I'm not mistaken, I took around 8 rolls of 36 exposures.
Gascon's relaxed and non-intrusive style of taking photos made Lee feel comfortable in front of the camera.
This is inside his Oxley residence. So he wanted to have a picture of him using the computer. I was lucky. I think I'm the only one who have photographed his bedroom. He's writing his first memoir on the computer, and he wanted to show Singaporeans that he's computer literate, and probably to urge people to, follow him suit. My dear Madame Lee Kuan Yew. So I was introduced to her, and so you are the photographer. Thank you very much for the nice pictures of my husband. He's always like a few steps away from the husband, but she's keenly observing what's going on. That's why it's always there's a space between them. So when I took this picture, I'm reminded of the saying that for every man is a strong woman.
George Gascon's photos continue to serve as invaluable archives that preserve Lee Kuan Yew's memory. For the photographer who took them, they're a fitting tribute to an important man and an inspiring subject. In Singapore, former school teacher and longtime Grassroots leader Jagjit Singh is driving to a special location, hidden in the heart of Tanjong Pagar.
We're heading towards a Spottiswoode Park estate. This place has very fond memories for me. This was the place where we first met Mr. Lee to set up the residence committee in Spottiswoode Park. And we all sat in front of him like we were sitting in a classroom and faced Mr. Lee as he called us individually and asked us whether we were prepared to serve in the residence committee of Spottiswoode Park.
Lee Kuan Yew was Member of Parliament for the ward from 1955 to 2015.
What he said to me, Mr. Jagjit Singh, you are a school teacher. Have you any problem in serving the residence committee? If I ask you, I say, no, sir. It will be my pleasure. With that, of course, there was some excitement. I mean, this is the leader of the country asking you to serve. So, of course, you felt that sense of pride too, that you have been picked to serve.
Jagjit went on to serve as a grassroots leader in Tanjong Pagar for nearly 3 decades. He remembers Lee as being less like a boss and more like a family patriarch.
At one National Day dinner, I was sitting on the same table with Mr. Lee. He was making sure that everybody ate, knowing that you are sitting with the Prime Minister, you will be nervous. You may not eat well, but he realized that people will be nervous sitting with him. So he used his chopsticks and he was putting the food in each of our bowls by turn as the food was coming. It was like the head of a family.
Many of Jagjit's interactions with Lee Kuan Yew took place here in the Tanjong Pagar Community Club, where many of the town's events were held. One memory that stands out was the day Lee was informed that Jagjit would be moving out of Tanjong Pagar to a private house in Seletar Hills.
So Mr. Lee turned around and asked me, have you done your mathematics? As a school teacher, how would you be able to afford to live in a landed property? Because you also have to consider about the education of your 2 children. It touched me that he was concerned that I was moving. A few days later, Mr. Lee, in his walkabout in the constituency, said the residents who move out, like me, could still come back and serve in the constituency. The wonderful part about Mr. Lee was, even at that level as the Prime Minister looking after the country, he was able to focus down to the common person. And he took an interest in what's happening on the ground, giving the common man a better life, a better stake in this country.
Dr. Ko Hock Kiat is known for his work promoting the learning of Mandarin in Singapore. He's also the founding director of the Confucius Institute here. But less commonly known is his stint as Lee Kuan Yew's Mandarin tutor.
我很难忘记是第一次跟他见面的时候呢，他就是问我有关于孔子为什么是一个圣人啊？他还引用了一句朱子语录所说的“天不生仲尼，万古如长夜”这样的一句话。当时我也很意外，李先生竟然能够了解博大精深的朱子语录的对孔子的这句话的评语。所以那天呢，我就开始觉得李光耀先生对儒家思想，特别是孔子的跟《论语》这本孔子与弟子相以言的这本书呢，有深刻的认识和了解。
Lee Kuan Yew also sought to understand Chinese perspectives of the world. To help him with this, Ko prepared readings from Chinese newspapers from both Singapore and overseas.
那我很惊讶说，开始的时候呢，他对社论的每一篇文章，几乎没有一个字他不认识的，而且不管是文句的那种理解，还有对语法的了解，甚至对那些拼音他都是 非常的熟悉，所以我一开始就觉得他的语言能力其实很强就是即使他在非常极度伤心跟病痛的日子呢，他还在坚持的学习华文。
如果我的英语是 A， 我的华语是 C，
Ko first met Lee Kuan Yew in 2006. Lee was then 83 and serving as minister mentor. In this role, he guided younger ministers. He also exhibited a keen interest in engaging with the youth.
那他一开始就没有把他们单独处理成一类词。
李光先生呢，也曾经要求我说找一些在南洋理工大学学习的一些研究生跟本科生，特别是来自外国的学生，跟他交流。然后他就跟他们交流，通常都是通过中文交流，然后呢来磨练他自己的语言，同时呢也借这个机会了解外国学生在新加坡遇到的一些困难，甚至有些他还尽他的能力去帮忙他们。所以我觉得是李光耀先生是一个非常有爱心，而且非常关心青年学生的一个长者。
You have asked a very important question which we have been asking ourselves.
Understanding the perspectives of young Singaporeans was vital to Lee, who saw them as the country's future. He participated in numerous forums where he would exchange views with the country's youth.
For example, it has been argued that more could be done for lower-income Singaporeans.
It was at one such event that Farouk Osman encountered Lee.
What measures should do safety net and ensuring that...
I could still remember it quite clearly. I remember asking Mr. Lee a question about what else could the government do to ensure a more equitable Singapore.
How would you do it? You tell me.
Oh, how I do it? Okay.
No, you have thought about the problem.
Yeah, sure.
How would you do it?
For the lower middle class. Okay.
Think over it carefully. Then you ask me a question the next time we meet.
Thanks a lot, sir.
When Mr. Lee threw back the question at me, I was firstly quite shocked because I don't remember him doing that to other questioners in the auditorium. When I went back to my seat, I felt slightly embarrassed, I would say. But I didn't mind because it got me thinking about if I were in government, what else could be done to help the lower-income Singaporeans?
Farouk's exchange with Lee Kuan Yew inspired him to pursue a career in public policy. Today, he works for the National Trades Union Congress, or NTUC, where he specializes in helping businesses and their workers improve productivity.
Based on my interaction with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, two things came to mind. The first one was clarity of thought, and the other was the importance of recognizing trade-offs in policy making. And these two learnings I bring with me to my current work at NTUC, where I've been involved in writing several policy research papers to help our workers achieve better income and better work prospects.
Former Singapore Airlines chairman Stephen Lee was also subject to Lee Kuan Yew's incisive questioning. In 2007, Stephen hosted Lee at the launch of Singapore Airlines' inaugural A380 fleet.
What stumped me was when he asked me, how many airports are 380 ready today? And how many airports will be 380 ready in the next 12 months? So I told Mr. Lee honestly that I didn't know, let me check. Mr. Lee would ask a fairly probing question because he thinks strategically.
The answer reached the minister mentor the next morning. There were 12 airports that could serve A380 planes in 2007. Another 10 would be operational the following year. Lee saw these destinations as opportunities for Singapore.
His interest is really to ensure that Singapore becomes a very successful air hub, and the air hub would allow Singapore to be connected to the rest of the world. In one of the meetings with union and management, first he sat down and he identified, and you are so-and-so, you represent, say, Xiasu, and you are so-and-so, you represent the pilots. Okay. So he went around, and then when he came to himself, he said, I represent Singapore. Okay. His message was, that we must put Singapore's national interest first. And then you will have to put aside your squabbles, okay, among yourself. Then concentrate on baking a bigger pie so everybody can have a bigger slice.
He's constantly thinking about the challenges and the problems. And so he would often work around the clock. It was a little bit stressful having to operate under those circumstances.
There is no direct link between the GIC and the CPF.
Ng Kok Song served in the Government Investment Corporation for nearly 30 years. Today, he is revisiting his old office.
After the official opening, Mr. and Mrs. Lee wanted to have a tour of the GIC office. I remember vividly Mr. and Mrs. Lee standing at the window, looking at the landscape, and then Mr. Lee was pointing to the large piece of reclaimed land, what is now the Marina Bay area, and was sharing with Mrs. Lee what the plans were for that piece of reclaimed land. The image of the two of them standing there still remains in my mind because it told me that not that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, he had a vision of Singapore society, multiracial, multi-religious, but people living in harmony. He also had a physical vision of Singapore. And what he was sharing with Mrs. Lee was part of the physical vision that he had.
In 2003, Ng's wife Patricia was diagnosed with cancer. He remembers observing the compassionate side of Lee amidst her battle with the illness.
One day while Patricia was undergoing chemotherapy at the hospital, she suddenly said to me, "I want to write a personal letter to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew." So she wrote the letter. "I thank God that we have been blessed with a leader who has a gifted vision and the courage, will, and ability to make his dream a reality." Mr. Lee wrote back, "I'm sad at this cruel act of fate. I understand how you and your family must feel. My family experienced it when we were told that Sen Lung himself was diagnosed with cancer. My wife and I send you and your family our sympathy, understanding, and support." When I returned home and said to Patricia that Mr. Lee had asked about her and told her not to give up, she was so delighted. She was thrilled to bits. And so Mr. Lee helped me and my family to keep Patricia cheerful right until her last days.
Patricia passed away in 2005. Ng turned to meditation to cope with his grief. When Lee heard about this, he asked Ng to help him with his own meditation.
Mr. Lee had explained to me that he had been struggling to meditate for quite a number of years. So I would go to his office for meditation sessions.
It helps me relax my mind and go to sleep.
Ng remembers well the day that Lee suddenly rescheduled their meditation appointment.
There was a story going around that Mr. Lee was not well, that he was under intensive care. So when I showed up for the meeting in his office, I was so relieved to see Mr. Lee very well. I said, "Shouldn't the government put out a statement to squash the rumor?" He says, "But there's no point putting out a statement. because one day it will be true. I think in his mind, he was hoping that not only would Singapore keep going, but Singapore would keep growing.
I'm only 83 years old. I think it is all because of his good work. I'm having a healthy, happy, wonderful life.
His thoughts, his ideas, his belief will live on long after him.
You live long, you learn long, never stop learning.
My most vivid memory of his passing was the day of his funeral. That afternoon, it was pouring, raining cats and dogs. Thousands of Singaporeans along that stretch of road in pouring rain, paying tribute, expressing sorrow and appreciation for what the man had done. And I thought that was a wonderful farewell that he got from the people he looked after for so many years.